Welcome to this explainer. When we look back at the devastating 2008 global financial crisis, it's so incredibly tempting to blame the whole shebang on bad math, right? Toxic mortgages, greedy algorithms, you name it. But the real story is actually a total psychological thriller. It wasn't just a failure of equations, it was a spectacular failure of human ego. Today, we're going to explore how the egos of some of the world's most powerful political and regulatory personalities actually engineered and amplified the collapse. And trust me, this absolutely matters for the money sitting in your bank account right now.
To really get our heads around this crisis, we have to look through a very specific psychological lens, the Dunning-Kruger effect. Now, you've probably heard of this. It's a cognitive bias where people with limited knowledge in a specific area vastly overestimate their own confidence. They literally lack the self-awareness to realize what they don't know. And as we're about to uncover, this exact blind spot was the fatal flaw for the world's top financial regulators. Okay, let's dive right into this. We'll break it down into 5 quick chapters. First, the architects of deregulation. Second, the Dunning-Kruger trap. Third, the rationalized panic. Fourth, today's shadow banking risks. And finally, designing policies for humility. It's a fascinating journey that reveals how a psychological flaw still threatens over half of today's global wealth. Let's start with Chapter 1, the architects of deregulation. Because before a crash can happen, the stage has to be set. And the stage for 2008 was built by some remarkably powerful political personalities. It really is a tale of two groups. On one side, you have the architects. These were bipartisan titans of policy, like Phil Gramm, Richard Shelby, Robert Rubin, Lawrence Summers, and Alan Greenspan, the untouchable minds of their era who built a regime favoring much lighter oversight. On the flip side, you have the crisis managers and executives, folks like Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke, Sheila Bair, and Richard Fuld. This second group, they were the ones left to navigate the brutal fallout when the system the architects built finally cracked. The policies championed by those architects radically reshaped global finance. Figures like Gramm and Shelby championed the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which tore down the old Glass-Steagall barriers, letting commercial and investment banks merge. Then you had the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which severely limited the oversight of over-the-counter derivatives. The prevailing, unshakable belief across the aisle was that these massive, integrated firms would basically just regulate themselves and be way more efficient. But unintentionally, this deregulatory environment masked massive systemic risk from the public, building an incredibly complex web of unregulated derivative markets.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, the Dunning-Kruger trap. This is where unprecedented complexity directly collides with massive human ego.
Think about the stark difference between these two financial worlds. On one hand, you have traditional commercial banking. It's transparent, it's highly regulated, and deeply understood by officials. But on the other hand, you have the new reality they were actually dealing with, shadow banking. This system was completely opaque, largely unregulated, maturity transformation. And because there was absolutely no central ledger for derivative exposures, no one could easily see who owed what to whom. It created these gaping information vacuums.
And here is where the psychology really kicks in. The crisis managers, brilliant folks like Hank Paulson and Sheila Bair, were undeniable titans of traditional banking. But the real danger is experts in one domain assuming expertise in another. They fell right into the trap. They operated with supreme confidence while flying totally blind in a shadow banking network that ran on completely different, hidden rules.
We see this overconfidence perfectly in their initial response to the crisis. When Lehman Brothers, led by the famously aggressive CEO Richard Fuld, teetered on the edge, the policy focus was heavily on moral hazard. The idea was, hey, let Lehman fail. Let's avoid rewarding reckless corporate behavior and let the market discipline itself. But this super-confident stance drastically miscalculated the reality. It completely failed to account for how Lehman's collapse would send shockwaves through those hidden global interconnections and shatter confidence overnight.
And that miscalculation leads us straight into Chapter 3, rationalized panic. What actually happens when the illusion of mastery breaks down and the smartest people in the room realize they're flying blind?
Well, it starts with this relatively small number, $785 million. That was the exposure the Reserve Primary Fund had to Lehman's commercial paper, essentially just short-term corporate IOUs. It made up a tiny 1.2% of its massive portfolio, but when Lehman went down, the fund had to write down that debt, dropping its share price to 97 cents. It broke the buck, and that seemingly minor technical event, that was the exact spark that ignited a global powder keg.
Because what followed was pure, unadulterated panic.
Over $300 billion flowed out of prime money market funds, almost instantly. Why? Because institutional cash managers were suddenly staring into an information vacuum. Lacking visibility, they just assumed every single fund was equally vulnerable. So they filled the void with worst-case assumptions, triggering a massive herd-like stampede.
You can see the sheer panic perfectly captured by the TED spread, which is a key barometer for credit risk in the banking system. Before Lehman, it was hovering around a calm 100 basis points, or 1%. Immediately after, it spiked past 300, eventually peaking over 450 basis points. Interbank lending just completely froze. Banks were literally too terrified to lend to one another because nobody knew who was holding the toxic assets.
Watch how this exact psychological feedback loop played out. You start with a systemic shock of Lehman. That hits an information vacuum because there's no central ledger. This triggers the Dunning-Kruger peak, where participants confidently make simplistic worst-case assumptions of total ruin. That sparks mass hysteria and a rush for the exits, which ultimately creates a self-fulfilling systemic lockup. So a technical credit event was transformed into a global freeze by human psychology.
The result? The government had to execute a staggering $700 billion TARP bailout program. $700 billion. This massive pivot really showcases the terrifying gap between the policymakers' assumed mastery of the system beforehand and the absolute on-the-ground reality of a system in total freefall.
So we move to Chapter 4, today's shadow banking. It's easy to look back at the political and regulatory personalities of 2008 and judge them, right? But why does this historical lesson actually matter for us today? It matters because of a massive shift in wealth. As of late 2025, non-banks, the shadow banking sector, now hold an estimated 51% of global financial assets. They hold the majority of the world's wealth, and this sector is expanding at double the rate of traditional, regulated banking. And the reality is, modern shadow banking relies heavily on private credit, open-ended funds, and complex opaque derivatives. The exact same structural fragilities from 2008, the leverage, the maturity transformation of using short-term cash for long-term risky bets, and most importantly, the lack of transparency, they are all still persisting in today's markets. We are still highly vulnerable to those information vacuums. Which brings us to our final chapter, Designing for Humility. Recognizing that human overconfidence is literally a systemic risk, how are policymakers in 2026 trying to build guardrails against our own nature?
Well, they're proposing some highly targeted structural safeguards to eliminate the dark spots. We're talking strict mandates for high-frequency central reporting so everyone knows exactly where the exposures are, expanded redemption gates to act as circuit breakers against herd stampedes. Add in a push for strict countercyclical margin haircuts, a pivot to regulating specific financial activities instead of just entities, and revitalizing the authority to designate non-banks as systemically important.
But perhaps most fascinating of all is this. Regulators are now targeting the behavioral risk itself. There are recommendations for mandatory scenario analysis and, get this, actual humility training for non-bank executives and regulators. They are literally forcing the people in charge to undergo unknown unknowns exercises. This intentionally combats the Dunning-Kruger effect, ensuring they don't decouple their confidence from probabilistic reality.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. Even with better data and all these new circuit breakers, is our current financial system truly built to withstand our ultimate vulnerability, the human ego? Rules and algorithms are one thing, but as we learned from the architects and managers of 2008, collective overconfidence in the face of ignorance can be way more destructive than any initial shock. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today. Keep asking questions and stay curious.